Good morning. That's a tough act to follow. Lisa didn't ask me to do special music. My name is Craig. Sorry, 7th grade never left me. My name's Craig Perro, and I get the privilege of serving here at Fuel as one of the elders. And Pastor Mike is away, and Pastor Norm is away. Pastor Greg is away. Pastor Pat is away. And I drew the short straw. Right? Yay! It's all good. No, like I said, at least they didn't ask me to do special music. Justin, you speak and let him sing. No, it's not going to work. But it's a privilege to serve here at Fuel and to be a part of the church family here. During the week, I get to serve as Executive Director of Operations at a place called One More Child. It's a nonprofit in town, formerly known as Florida Baptist Children's Homes. You may have heard of it. We serve, yes, amen, that ministry. We provide Christ-centered services to vulnerable children and struggling families. And last year, we were able to care for 236,492 children and families. And that's, yes, a significant number. We keep track of that number because every one really does matter. And so we claim those numbers. And yes, I have to memorize that number so I can say it to you and others. And there's a quiz, right, every Monday in our devotions. There's not. But we know that number. It's important. And we also were able to provide over 14 million meals to children and families locally and globally, all over Florida and then in other places in the world. And we're able to do that because of other individuals, over 200,000, that have partnered with us in training and in advocacy and in volunteering. So we don't do that just alone. We do that with others. And we're very, very grateful that I could be a part of that organization and serve there. I'm the Executive Director of Operations, which really means that I'm over the compassion centers. I oversee our distribution of those food meals, other things that come and go, and get to provide those resources to our programs internally, like foster care and single moms and family support and those other kind of programs, along with other external partners like Fuel Church. So we have a number, really a few hundred partners in the community that stretch all over Florida and even in a few other states. And we're able to provide all of these meals and other things for them and strengthen the work that they're doing as well. So really cool, and my commercial is done. We'll leave it at that. We're going to jump into After God's Own Heart, Lessons from the Life of David. We're continuing in that series, and we'll be in a couple places. It'll be on the screen, but if you have a Bible and want to turn there, we'll be in 1 Samuel 20, and then also 2 Samuel 9. 1 Samuel 20, 2 Samuel 9, and I'll go off my notes here. I don't often get to do this, so this will be fun. We get to go through this text, but you have no idea what's on my notes, right? So I could say whatever I want, right? And you won't know the difference. A man after God's own heart. As we start off thinking about that, thinking about the life of David, I thought about this week, and as Pastor Mike has been going through this series, we think of it, and when I've heard that phrase before, I've thought of David, right? And we think of David, a man after God's own heart, and we think, that's what he did. But what it was that he did that's significant about that phrase is that he went after God's heart. Right? We're studying the life of David, but we're not really studying the life of David, are we? We're really looking in the life of David for what is God's heart. What was it that David emulated there? What is it that he reflected and went after of God's heart that we can go after as well? And I'll give you the word for the day right up front. It's a Hebrew word, and I'll let the cat out of the bag on that, and then we can keep moving on with it and describing it and everything and working through our text. The word is, in the Hebrew, hesed, which is not really the right way you pronounce it. You really have to almost like clear your throat when you say it. It's like chesed, okay? So I'm not going to say it that way the whole day, right? It's bad enough that my voice squeaks, right? So I'll just say hesed, and you'll know that in the Hebrew it's a little different. But that's a very rich word in the Hebrew that we're going to see the meanings of. So we'll pick up the story. We're really looking at the story in 2 Samuel 9, where David, after God's own heart, demonstrates kindness or hesed to Mephibosheth in 2 Samuel 9. But the story really starts back in 1 Samuel 20. So we need to look there and start there. All right? In 1 Samuel 20, we see the relationship with Jonathan and David. And here we find this covenant that they've made with each other. And it's not the first time it's come up. It also comes up in chapter 18 and then later on in chapter 23. But it just says in those chapters that they had a covenant with each other. And it doesn't give any real details about what that was and what that looked like, right? And, of course, at this point in David's life, he's a wanted man. King Saul is after him. And Jonathan is switching his alliances, his allegiances here. And, of course, he has followed his father, King Saul. And things are changing. So we pick it up in verse 14 through 17, reads this. This is Jonathan speaking to David. He says, "If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of God from the face of the earth." And Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies." And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. So a couple things that we want to pick out of this passage. It's a pretty significant event, and this is really the crux of the covenant that they have made with each other. So Jonathan says, "If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love." There's our hesed word right there. Here it's translated steadfast love. The steadfast love, notice he says, of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love, a second time, from my house forever. So 2 times we see this word emphasized here. And it's emphasized not just, again, David and Jonathan's steadfast love for each other, but the Lord's steadfast love. So he says, "If I'm still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever." Interesting here, he uses this phrase again, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. It's interesting because in the next verse, Jonathan made a covenant. And if you know the word covenant and where that comes from, the meaning of the word is to cut. And it takes me back to Genesis 15 when God established his covenant with Abraham. And if you look back at that text, for some it could be kind of gross, but God told him, "Take these animals, and I want you to cut them in half, except for the birds." He didn't cut them in half. I don't know why. And place them opposite each other, right, on the rock, and place the birds opposite each other. And the Lord passed through these animals with fire and proclaimed his promises to Abraham. And that's where we get the first instance of this covenant. And I see that here in this text, not just the covenant, but Jonathan says, "And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever," when the Lord cuts off all the enemies of David from the face of the earth. And then again, and Jonathan cut a covenant with the house of David. See, in these texts, in these narratives, there's often play on words and often these memory hooks for us to capture the storyline as we read through, or as often was the case, as someone would read it, and you wouldn't be reading it in a book, you would be hearing it, right? And you would pick up on these phrases and these words and how they're connected. So that's, I think, what's going on here. Jonathan is saying, look, we're establishing this covenant with each other, right, this cutting. And I think of more present day, what you've seen maybe in movies, where, these two guys establish a blood brotherhood, right? And they take a knife, and they cut their hand, and the other guy cuts his hand, and then, they shake. And all you medical people out there are saying, what a wonderful way to share your blood pathogens and your diseases, right? And you see that in movies, Do we ever see anybody do that? I've never seen anybody in real life do this, but you see that in the movies. This is how they establish this alliance, this allegiance with each other, where they cut their hands, right? And I don't know that that's what took place here with Jonathan and David. The text doesn't say that there was any real cutting going on, but yet the phrases are used here. So we see steadfast love, and then we see this idea of covenant here. And then Jonathan says, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth, which is really interesting that he would say this, that he would make this kind of covenant with David, knowing who his father is and knowing the relationship his father has right now with David. So you see that Jonathan has switched and is now making his allegiance, his alliance with David rather than with his father. And really, in this instance, if in a sense, has doomed him already and knows the outcome of his father Saul. Saying, may the Lord take vengeance on the enemies of David. This was a pretty significant event, I believe, in the life of David as well as Jonathan. It wasn't a casual agreement. It wasn't just, this pinky promise, right, that they made. Okay, yeah, things go well for me, things go well for you. Yeah, I'll see you later. When we get back together, we'll do that. It wasn't a casual affair. It was a pretty serious commitment. One scholar says this: commitment is about loyalty and love in the face of discouragement and difficulty. This commitment is a very deep, costly, and profound one. It has the form of a covenant, which in the Bible is a binding commitment to love, sealed with promises. Jonathan, with eyes of big faith, trusts that the Lord will give David the final victory. And it's coming, and we're going to get there in just a minute. So as we move through the narrative, we move now to 2 Samuel 3. We move from 1 Samuel into 2 Samuel. And as Pastor Mike has shared, there's, in these texts, this narrative, sometimes it's hard to piece together the timeline and what's taken place. It's very selective. It's selective narrative, right? There are so many stories that could be given that aren't. There's so many details that could be given that aren't. And I think that puts greater weight on the things that we do see, we do hear about. So over in 2 Samuel 3, as the chapter starts out in verse 1, we see this is after the death of Saul and Jonathan. And we see that David's house here continues to increase, and Saul's house continues to decrease. So, it wasn't like there was a point in time where all of a sudden, one day, the kingdom of Saul is there, and then the next day it's gone, and the kingdom of David is set up. It's not how it works, right? And we think of the political nature of our day and how things ebb and flow, right, with different political parties, not just here in the United States, but in other places in our world, right? Very little happens overnight, right? And that's the case here. But in 3:1 it says, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. And David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. So we see this transition going on to the kingship of David, where it's approaching its height. The kingship of Saul is passing away, and his men and those that are loyal to him, they're passing away. And through these wars, those warriors for Saul, they keep dying off because the Lord keeps giving victory to David over and over again. So things are changing here in our story, all right? Now we continue on to chapter 4, and we find out about this young man, Mephibosheth. In 2 Samuel 4:4, this is where we first learn of Jonathan's son. And the context is of Saul's son, Ishbosheth, Jonathan's brother, who has put himself up as king, right? And he has some that are following him, but they're not very nice people. He has a couple of captains that it doesn't take too long, and they turn on him, and they kill him. And the text is giving us in this context, who is left of the house of Saul? Is there anyone there that can carry on this kingly lineage? And it says in verse 4 of chapter 4, 2 Samuel, Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. And his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame. And his name was Mephibosheth. So the text doesn't say, we see crippled in his feet, we see, that he's lame. We don't know the extent of that. But we know that having this condition disqualified him from becoming king. One writer emphasizes that with the death of Ishbosheth, there was no other viable claimant to the throne of the house of Saul. Crippled or lame meant that he was thus disqualified from contesting David and David's position as king. So we're seeing already that the kingdom of Saul continues to pass away, right? That's what's going on in our story. All right, now we get a little closer to the text. We come to the end of chapter 8 in 2 Samuel. And chapter 8 is full of David's victories. So we know that God gave David victory wherever he went. And chapter 8 recounts that. All the different nations, all the different peoples that he fought and was winning all the battles, right? And we're just going to look at that one verse at the end, toward the end, verse 14. And there's one phrase that gives us this indication. Toward the end of the chapter, it says in verse 14, "And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went." So the Lord cut off every one of David's enemies at this point. So the prophetic word, if you will, small p, right? Not that we're calling Jonathan a prophet, but that word that Jonathan had spoken before, that God would cut off all of David's enemies, is now coming about. And we get this even more clear from our chapter 9. All right, so now we're moving into our story. And we'll come back to this Hesed here. All right, but let's read through, stick with me, right? We'll read through chapter 9 and then come back and talk about it, okay? So I'm just going to blaze a trail. Here we go. Sorry if I butcher these other names, right? And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there not still someone of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God to him?" Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." The king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar." Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he answered, "Behold, I am your servant." And David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father. And you shall eat at my table always." And he paid homage and said, "What is your servant, that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I?" Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. I thought about just nicknaming Mephibosheth Bo, but I thought you probably might not like that. I don't know. It might sound, like we're not giving honor here. So I didn't know if I wanted to do that, but I knew I had to slow down when you say Mephibosheth. You try to say Mephibosheth 5 times fast, right? And then put an S on the end of it when it's, possessive of something. Mephibosheth, there's too many S's and too many THs there. Sorry, I just had to share that a little bit. All right, in the text, we come back to Hesed, which is really cool, right? So here's David, and before we get to Hesed, David has conquered the land, right? Everywhere he sends his army, they win, right? So he's really getting to the place where his kingdom is at peace. Maybe not quite yet. There are other battles still that they fight after this. But he's at such a place in his kingship where verse 1 recalls to his mind, I think, the covenant that he set up with Jonathan. Here we have in chapter 8, at the end of chapter 8, that David had victory wherever he went, right? What did Jonathan say? Don't forget about me. Show hesed to me and my family when God wipes out all your enemies off the face of the earth, right? So is that literal? Well, could be literal, could be a bit figurative. But David, at this point, I think recalls that. And this is probably some 15 to 20 years later or so. And I don't know about you, but I don't know that if anyone said to me, all right, I had a very important conversation with you about 20 years ago. Do you remember what we said? My wife could probably do it because she has a great memory, right? But I don't have that kind of memory. But David recalls it. It was such a significant event in his life that he recalls it. And he doesn't just recall what was said, but what needs to take place. And he says, hey, is there anyone left of the house of Saul? And what is he really asking? He's not really asking about Saul. He's asking specifically about the house of Jonathan. That's what he's really asking about. We know that, of course, from the text. We know that from what Ziba said. Yes, there is someone of the household of Jonathan. And here's Mephibosheth, who has been tucked away somehow over in this other land, right, with this man Maker in Lodabar. And we don't know much more about him. We don't know much more about that circumstance. You know, was it well there with him? How much did Maker have to take care of Mephibosheth? We don't know. What's the extent of his lameness? Can he provide for himself or not? The text doesn't give us these details. But it does just continue to say over and over and over again, hey, don't forget about when we say the name Mephibosheth, he's lame in his feet, right? It's almost like every time his name comes up, he has this qualifier, you know, that he can't be king, right? And some of us, it's, you know, that way. Some people, you know, when they refer to me, it's like, hey, you know that guy Craig? You know the bald one? You know, the short bald one, right? That's usually how it goes, right? There's usually some kind of characteristics that's connected to someone, right? And here with Mephibosheth, it's, oh yeah, the guy with the lame feet. I don't know, maybe he walked with a limp. I have no idea, but he couldn't be king. So here is David's kindness to Mephibosheth. And we have this word again. Comes up 3 times in verse 1 to show kindness, right, for Jonathan's sake. Verse 3, he says the kindness of God, mirroring what Jonathan had said, the kindness of the Lord. And then in verse 7, where David says to him, do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. So what is it with this word, kindness? And back in 1 Samuel, it was called steadfast love. Well, let me give you some descriptions, some definitions, and some examples of this word in the scriptures and how it's used. So kindness, or hesed, right? It's the same word that we see in 1 Samuel 20. And then the term appears here 3 times. It also occurs in the Old Testament in Hebrew 251 times. 251 times. In 241 verses. So a couple of verses it's used twice. Right? So it's, in a sense, common, since it's used so much. And yet it's a very rich word, hard to translate into our English. It can be translated in these ways. 149 times it's translated mercy. 40 times it's translated kindness. 30 times loving kindness. 12 times goodness. And of course we know about steadfast love, and there's some other variations. The word means kindness or love between people, specifically of the devotional piety of people towards God, as well as of love or mercy of God towards humanity. So it's not just this relationship that we would have, but it's the relationship that we would have with God, really that God has with us, where God bestows his mercy and his grace and his love, his loving kindness, his steadfast love to us. It carries the idea of tenderness and consideration toward others. So the definition used of man it can be termed kindness of men toward men in doing favors or benefits. Kindness extended to the lowly or the needy or miserable. Mercy is another translation here. Used of the kindness of God, it's his loving kindness in condescending to the needs of his creatures. So specifically loving kindness in redemption from enemies and troubles. Loving kindness in preservation of life from death. Loving kindness in quickening of spiritual life. Redemption from sin. Also in keeping the covenants with Abraham and Moses and Israel. The word is sometimes grouped with other divine attributes of God. And then the Psalms describe this kindness of God as being abundant, great in extent, everlasting, and good. So in an attempt to sort of define the term, some scholars have said this: it is wrapping up in itself all the positive attributes of God: love, covenant faithfulness, mercy, grace, kindness, loyalty. In short, acts of devotion and loving kindness that go beyond the requirements of duty. Another scholar says it's not just a feeling but an action. It intervenes on behalf of loved ones and comes to their rescue. It is not romantic, but faithful and reliable love. It is loyal, put to action, practical action on behalf of another. Hesed surpasses ordinary kindness and friendship. It is the inclination of the heart to show amazing grace to the one who is loved. Hesed runs deeper than social expectations, responsibilities, fluctuating emotions, or what is deserved or earned by the recipient. Hesed finds its home in committed familial love, and it comes to life in actions. It is the unfailing love God has for you. The word points to the enduring love of God. There's of course, a lot of examples that we could go to in the scriptures, right, to look at this word hesed to see what does this really mean and how is it described. We'll look at just a couple of them here that I think are pretty significant. The first one in Exodus 34, verse 6. And this is the occasion where Moses is on the mountain with God, and Moses has had this interaction with God and says, I'd like to know more of you. I'd like to know more of who you are. I'd like to know more of your character, right? And God says, well, you can't see my face, right? Any man that sees me dies. That's not going to happen. So God hides him in the rock, right, and passes before him while he's covering him. And while this is happening, this is the Lord Yahweh, and this is what he declares about himself. And that's why I think this is so significant. This isn't David or another psalmist or some other author, right? This is actually describing what God says about himself. God says he has hesed. The Lord passed, verse 6, the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in, there's our word, steadfast love, hesed, and faithfulness. And then verse 7 starts off with that, keeping steadfast love, keeping hesed for thousands. I think that's a great text that helps us see with a little more clarity what it is that God has as his character. Also in Genesis 40, the word is used there by Joseph to the chief baker while they're in prison. Remember, the chief baker and the chief cupbearer both end up in jail, right? They end up there with Joseph. And Joseph's been there a little while. But Joseph can interpret dreams, right? So they dream dreams, and the chief baker goes first and says, okay, Joseph, I had this dream. Can you interpret it? And he interprets it, right? And it's a favorable interpretation. So the cupbearer thinks that this is going to be good. But before the cupbearer steps in, Joseph says in Genesis 40:14, he says this to the chief baker. Because to the baker, he said, you're going to be exalted again. You're going to be, back with the king here shortly. And he says, only remember me when it's well with you. And please do me this kindness. Please do me this hesed, right? To mention me to Pharaoh. And so get me out of this house. And we know that didn't quite go that way. But here's our word, hesed. Also, it's used with Jacob when he requests of Joseph that he not be buried in Egypt in Genesis 47. In verse 29, it says, and when the time drew near that Israel, another name for Jacob, must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me." That word kindly is our word hesed. "Do not bury me in Egypt." And he continues on. It's also used in many of the Psalms, and there's a phrase that's used a few times repeatedly, Psalm 86, Psalm 103, Psalm 145, and it says this, "The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love," abounding in hesed. It's also in the stories of Ruth with Naomi, her mother-in-law, also Ruth and Boaz. It's in there a few times in that storyline. It's also in the storyline of Esther, Queen Esther. And hesed, the loyal love, is established there. So here, David is seeking to show this kind of loyal love to Jonathan, this kindness to Jonathan through his son Mephibosheth. So we have kind of now an idea of what he's going after. And it's, he could have brought him in and he could have said, Mephibosheth, I just wanted you to know, that I'm not seeking your life. I'm not going to kill you. All is well between us. All is well with your house, with Saul. Let bygones be bygones. You go your way in peace. I'll go my way in peace. And let's just end it there, right? But that's not what he did. It's not passive. Hesed is not passive. It's very active. It's very involved, very engaged. So he doesn't do that. Instead, he pursues him. And as we walk through that text, we see that Ziba, who was Saul's servant, who has 15 sons and 20 servants of his own, probably a prominent figure during that time. And he's been a servant of Saul and now is commissioned to serve Mephibosheth and take care of this land, take care of this property, right? And Mephibosheth is now able to just spend his days at the king's house and eat with the king. So he's gone from a nobody, right, obscure, whisked away to Maker's house, and now he's brought back, and he lives as one of the king's sons in this amazing place of honor. There's lots of other little details here that we'll skip over in the text. I think we've hit the main point. Let me jump to some points that we can make from this. So first of all, even when things were going well, and David would not gain anything from it, David kept his covenant with Jonathan and honored Mephibosheth. David put his commitment to show kindness above his own success and prosperity. Mephibosheth had nothing to offer him. No political gain, no financial gain, no alliances, nothing. David had nothing to gain in this other than the joy of keeping his honor and fulfilling his commitment to love and honor Jonathan and his family. I think in this text, the character of David really shines forth in how loyal he is. I think back to those occasions when Saul was seeking him and seeking his life, and he was hiding, and Saul came out there, and David comes from the cave and, cuts off a piece of his robe, right? And then he feels bad and says, how could I, do this against the Lord's anointed? And you hear that over and over again in David's life, right? And you see this in this occasion. David has no ill will. Here's an opportunity for him, and here's another point to this. Here's an opportunity for him to finally take vengeance on the house of Saul. He could truly wipe it out if he wanted, but he doesn't. Instead, he remembers his loyal love, his hesed that he has for Jonathan and for Jonathan's family. David and Jonathan's covenant was established under and for the honor of God's kindness. The focus of Jonathan and David was that the character of God would be evident in their commitments to one another. They were seeking to act out the hesed of God. I think that's wonderful to see. Jonathan says that, the hesed of the Lord. And then David recounts that again, the hesed from God. They recognized what we have said up here, that this isn't just David, a man with great character. This is David, a man after God's own heart. He's going after what describes God. And here, he and Jonathan both emulate God's hesed, God's faithful, loyal, loving kindness. David carried out loving kindness in his actions to Mephibosheth. He carried them out. It was not merely internal, heartfelt response of sympathy or goodwill. It wasn't be warmed, be filled, go in peace. None of that, right? No, instead, David had to pass the potatoes down to Mephibosheth at dinner time every night, right? He was there in his presence all the time. And note that this took some sacrifice on his part as well. It doesn't say that David owned the land, but I'm sure he had authority over it. He had authority over it to give it back to Mephibosheth, and he could have gained financially from that. It would have been much easier if he had kept it for himself or used it for other alliances, something of that nature. But instead, he gives that land back to Mephibosheth and to the house of Saul. It cost him something. Sometimes hesed means sacrifice on our part. And again, David's commitment to honor Jonathan and show him kindness outweighed any thoughts of vengeance that he might have. So is there anything in the New Testament that kind of carries over these ideas? There's plenty of scriptures, of course, just a couple of them to highlight. In Luke 6, we get Jesus' words at the end of Luke 35 and 36. This is after he has said, what good is it for you to love those that love you? Right? You should love your enemies. What good is it to do good to those that do good to you? What good is it to lend expecting to receive something in return? Right? It's that passage. 35 and 36, it says, but love your enemies. This is, again, Jesus speaking. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. And then verse 36, be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. In Ephesians 4:32, it reads, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. A similar passage in Colossians 3:12 says, put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. So how does this play out in our lives today? It should, and of course we sang about it just a little bit ago. I think just as David sought to fulfill his end of the covenant with Jonathan by demonstrating the Lord's kindness, so ought we to seek to reflect the Lord's kindness in our interactions with others. And the reason is not so others think of us as kind, but that others see the Lord in us through kindness. And I think we have ample opportunity, as we read about this and see how hesed is heavily connected, heavily tied to loyalty and to covenant. My mind goes pretty easily to marriage and the covenant that we have established there. There's all kinds of opportunities in marriage, isn't there, to demonstrate hesed to your spouse. That's not the only place, but we have opportunity there. What about those neighbors that can be irritating, right? And you'd rather just let them do their thing and you do your thing, right? And maybe build the fence a little higher, so that you can separate, right? But is that hesed, really? Nothing against fences, right? But what does the text say? That we have to demonstrate this. And just like we sang the song, right? Monday morning faith. It's wonderful that we come in here. It's wonderful that we can look at these scriptures and see the connection here. David fulfilling this covenant that's so awesome. We come in and sing these wonderful songs and worship the Lord here and fellowship and, really soak this in. This is all great stuff, right? But if we leave here and this is it, and we don't do anything, we don't actually live differently Monday and Tuesday, then we can't say, like David, that we have hesed and that we are living after God's own heart. So I know we're just heading into summer. So students, here's a thought for you. I know that you don't have homework for the summer unless your mother's a Nazi, right? Just kidding. Just kidding. You can tell how much I love school. No, it's all good. Some of you may have homework for the summer. Maybe you need it, okay? But here's a thought for you. Since things are a little different now, right? How about you set yourself a goal to read the scriptures and pray one time a day. Doesn't even have to be long, right? I mean, you have these devices, you have your phone, you can get these apps, right? The YouVersion app, and you can practice what is preached, right? Now, I'm saying this to students, but all of us really could take this to heart, right? And I know that, and it's true in my own life. I've studied scriptures for many years, right? And done devotions, right? And I found sometimes I would do well, and then sometimes, I would fade off. And then I'd say, wow, when was the last time I opened that app? That kind of a thing. And a couple years ago, we have our fast that we do at Fuel here every January. And I said, I think I should sacrifice a little bit of my sleep. Again, speaking to some of you that like your sleep, right? And I said, I think I should sacrifice a little bit more of that and really put some more time into this. So I did, and the Lord has been good, very good. And I've been able to do this. And this was January of 22 that I started this. And I don't say that for my own benefit. I say that for the Lord's benefit. And you could do the very same thing, to dedicate a little more of your time to commit to make this covenant with the Lord, to stay closer. There's all kinds of examples that we could give. There's all kinds of directions that we could take this. But I think it's just important that we know, as we said, the reason that we would do this, right? And I'll read that again. It's not so that others think of us as kind, but that others see the Lord in us through kindness. So I pray that that's an encouragement to you, a challenge to you, and that as you see that in David's life and see the Lord in his life, that you would be convicted to commit more of your day, more of your time, more of your activities throughout the week to being Hesed to everyone around you. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word this morning. Thank you that we've had a chance to look into it and to glean this from it. Father, we thank you for David and for his life and example that he set. And most of all, we thank you for the fact that he revealed to us more of you and more of who you are. Lord, I would just pray as we have sung today, and as I know is our desire, that as we leave here and go throughout our week and go throughout our summer, Father, might we truly be different throughout the week as well. Might we not forget about your word, but might we live it out each and every day. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.